Shy boy and so-so student became interested in movie making from an uncle who was a screenwriter. While he was at school, his mother died of complications from minor surgery, and 2 years later, in 1924, he lost his father to a heart attack. Although he was only 19, Hughes moved swiftly to establish sole ownership of the lucrative Hughes tool business. His backbone and his independence came as a surprise to relatives and to company executives alike. In 1925, Hughes married Ella Rice of the socially prominent Houston family which founded Rice University, and the couple moved to Los Angeles. There, funded by earnings from the tool company, Hughes began producing movies, learning on the job and learning fast. A silent film called Everybody's Acting was his first release. Then he made a comedy that actually won an Oscar, Two Arabian Nights. As he planned his 1927 hit movie about World War I airmen, no detail was too small to escape his notice. And when he cast unknown Harleen Carpenter, he introduced America to Jean Harlow.
Would you be shocked if I put on something more comfortable?
A pattern of control emerged in the making of Hell's Angels that stayed with Hughes. Raymond Fowler was the psychologist called in during litigation proceedings after his death.
He really had to control every aspect, from the editing, from the filming, from the story. He was so concerned with details on Hell's Angels that he actually purchased many, many airplanes. I remember someone estimated that he personally had the fourth largest air force in the world just to develop that, just to produce that one movie. And he was so involved in every aspect of it that he almost ruined it, as he did most of the things that he tried to control.
Hughes' marriage went up in smoke in 1929 when Ella Rice divorced him. He was too busy bringing his first Broadway play to the screen, with some lines that echoed his own hypochondria.
I just had an interview with Williams, over in that death house. That jail is reeking with germs.
In 1931, Hughes cast a young Spencer Tracy in another movie about aviation. He gave the pseudonym. He was hired on as a junior pilot with American Airlines, but was discovered after only one flight and shown the door. To executive Noah Dietrich, Hughes now handed over day-to-day operations of the tool company. This left Howard more time to pursue aspiring actresses like Ginger Rogers, who once recalled the complexity of the man she had dated.
I could tell how resentful he was of anyone coming close to us in conversation. He resented it very much, and he just wouldn't hold still for somebody walking up to the table.
Flying record, but the flight ended in his first brush with death.
This beach field is not a very appropriate setting for this little airplane, which is the new holder of the world's land plane speed record. Its first landing here was caused by motor failure. I looked about and decided this field was the best spot. Put the plane down here with the retractable landing gear retracted, as landings in rough country are safer with the wheels up.
There was a reckless side to his courage in planes or in automobiles. He went to court for hitting and killing a pedestrian with his car, but it was ruled an accident.
Over a period of 10 years, he was badly injured on numerous occasions, often to his head. I'd say 6 or 8 times within a 10-year period, he had head injuries, some of which led to unconsciousness. I feel pretty sure that the injuries that he had caused an increasing detriment in his functioning and also caused him to have other accidents.
How does it feel to go hurtling through space at 290 miles an hour?
Well, at 18,000 feet, there's not much sensation. You're so far above the Earth.
Are you going to fly that plane back to the coast?
Not right away, anyway.
Do you intend to break any more records?
I'm not sure.
Why did you make the plane? What kick do you get out of this?
Oh, hell, now that question wasn't it.
In 1936, Hughes set 2 more records, cutting the flying time between major U.S. cities and pioneering the concept of commercial aviation. The next year, in his H-1, he broke his own transcontinental record, flying from Los Angeles to Newark in the then amazing time of 7 hours and 28 minutes. He left Burbank, California in the summer of 1938 for what would be his grandest flying adventure, This was the attempt to fly around the world in his Lockheed 14.
Howard, what are your plans for the flight?
We hope to get away in a week or two and fly to Paris.
Are you going to fly alone?
No, there'll be 5 of us.
Hughes and his crew started on the first leg of the trip with the New York World's Fair logo for good luck. From New York to Paris, it would take 16 hours and 38 minutes, an astonishing feat, cutting in half the time of Lindbergh's historic flight. The unconventional Hughes seldom dressed like a pilot, but the French still greeted him as the world's foremost aviator. From Paris, Hughes flew to Moscow and then across Siberia, where he nearly crashed into the side of a mountain incorrectly located on the map. There were also pleasant surprises along the way.
So much is made over Lindbergh.
The flight took Hughes to Fairbanks, Alaska, and then back into the continental United States. When he reached New York on July 14th, landing at Floyd Bennett Field, he established the new around-the-world record of 3 days, 19 hours, and 28 minutes.
Congratulations. Welcome home.
Mayor LaGuardia led millions of Americans in lionizing the pilot, the hero out of one of his own movies, larger than life and yet modest. But there was nothing modest about his next step, buying 2 regional airlines and molding them into TWA.
The idea of building an airline like TWA, designed one of the great propeller-driven passenger planes of all time, the Constellation, which remains to this day. None of the current generation has probably ever even seen a Constellation, but the Constellation was one of the most gorgeous airplanes ever built, with its 3 tails, and it revolutionized air travel at the time.
At Los Angeles, passengers go aboard for a sky voyage that begins a new airline schedule of daily, non-stop, coast-to-coast flights by Constellation planes. The pilot is Howard Hughes of Round the World fame, and among the passengers are motion picture stars like Celeste Holm and Hollywood actors Cary Grant and Frank Morgan, 35 representatives of motion pictures, news, and business. Linda Darnell is one, and so is Nancy Guild, newest of stars. She plays in Somewhere in the Night. Coast to coast, and here's New York, seen for the first time by Cinderella girl Nancy Guild. Life has a lot that's new when you're suddenly up there with Linda Darnell in the Hollywood galaxy of stars.
With war underway in Europe in 1939, Hughes began work on the D-2, a medium-range bomber. After 3 years of development, the military rejected the plane, and ironically, some people believe the Japanese adapted the design to build their famous Zero fighter plane. The amphibious Sikorsky S-43 was another of Hughes' pet projects at this time. As German U-boats took their toll on Allied shipping lines, industrialist Henry J. Kaiser proposed the idea of a giant flying boat to President Roosevelt to ferry men and material across the ocean. Kaiser was a shipbuilder, not an airplane maker, and so he turned to Howard Hughes for assistance with the project. Hughes hired PR men like John Meyer to grease wheels in the nation's capital.
He realized you had to make campaign contributions. You had to hire people who knew politicians, who knew the way to his being, which was then beginning to accelerate into the kind of recluse that we saw by the end of his life.
The pressures from his many projects caused Hughes to suffer his first nervous breakdown in August of 1944.
One of the characteristics of Howard Hughes is when he became overstressed, he had to get away from it. And flying served that purpose. When you fly, you tend to be alone. You tend to go off all by yourself. Nobody can get to you. You can't get telephone calls, and no one can knock on the door and bother you. And what he did was simply get in a plane and fly away. He spent months simply flying around the Southwest. He'd make touch-and-go landings all day long, and then stay overnight or 2 or 3 nights in a motel room, where he would just turn off all the lights and sit in a darkened room, sometimes for 2 or 3 days. And throughout that whole period, it seemed that he was protecting himself. You know, the word asylum means a place of protection, and he was making for himself an asylum, a way that he could get away from stress and human contact.
In 1946, Hughes was back in the saddle, this time in the FX-11, his design for a reconnaissance plane. In a test flight, one of the propellers lost oil and reversed its pitch. Hughes was nearly killed when the plane crashed into a house. While recovering, he became addicted to codeine and would never shake that addiction. To hide the scars on his face, he grew a mustache. More of the life and times of Howard Hughes when biography returns. To our profile of Howard Hughes. In 1946, only months after his near-fatal crash, Howard Hughes took up his FX-11 to show the world he was still an airman. That done, it was time to face the biggest challenge of his aviation career, the flying boat project. People who worked on it called it Hercules, but to the American public, it was the Spruce Goose, made of wood because metal was in short supply. With a wingspan longer than a football field, this was an airship well suited to the dreamer in Howard Hughes. And for this maverick tycoon and his seat-of-the-pants company to guide the Spruce Goose from drawing board to launch in less than 3 years has to rank as one of the great dare-to-do-it stories in American enterprise. By the time the plane was finished, World War II was over. But that didn't keep Senator Ralph Brewster, who was investigating waste and corruption in the defense industry, from targeting Hughes and his Hercules project.
Now, Senator Brewster's story, as related here yesterday, is a pack of lies, and I can tear it apart if allowed to cross-question him. And it is unfair to place me in the position of having my integrity questioned and not being allowed to cross-examine Senator Brewster.
All right,
Yesterday, you told me I would be accorded the same privilege as the senator from Maine or anyone else here. Now, will you give me the questions in advance that you want to ask me while I am here? Or will you give them to any third neutral party? Is it not true that you are going to propound the questions for me as I testify and based upon what I testify as I go along? Are you willing to set aside the questions in advance which you will ask me?
Mr. Hughes.
Whenever he was badgered by the committee, Hughes stood his ground and seemed to gain the upper hand as the hearings continued.
Well, now, Mr. Hughes, I'm asking you what your answer was. And we're not going to have this bickering back and forth. You are before this committee, and you're going to answer the question.
You asked me just now about a reply that I made. My answer is I don't remember. Now, the man is taking it down there.
Well, I'll ask you again.
Let's ask him. What?
Will you bring Mr. Mars in at the 2 o'clock session?
No, I don't think I will.
Will you try to bring him in?
No, I don't think I'll try.
During a break in the hearings, Hughes ordered the Spruce Goose towed from its hangar with the intention of settling things for good. He invited his hydraulic engineer to be his co-pilot on the flight.
Okay, at that time, our chief engineer, who later on became general manager, was Ray Hopper, who was my boss. And Ray came into my office and he said, Howard wants you to be the co-pilot on the flight. I said, why? He said, I don't know, he just wants you to be. And I said, does he know I don't fly? And he said, yeah, maybe that's why he wants you.
A successful flight of the Hercules would pull the rug out from under the Senate committee's questioning of the project. As it happened, the plane was airborne for just 1 mile on that day before Hughes set it down again in Long Beach Harbor. But the flight proved the Spruce Goose, 3 times heavier than any plane ever built, was indeed a boat that could fly. After the historic flight, Hughes confounded the critics even further. Instead of handing the plane over to the government, he exercised his option to lease it. He would keep the Spruce Goose in air-conditioned storage for the rest of his life at a cost to him of $1 million a year. As controversial as this airplane was Hughes's 1946 movie starring sexy new Discovery Jane Russell on billboards across the country. Hollywood's first new film in a decade, provoked so many disputes with censors, its release was delayed 4 years. Rumors of steamy love scenes guaranteed its success at the box office anyway, as Hughes had anticipated.
What's your name?
Real.
What's the rest of it?
McDonald.
McDonald.
In the movie, The Outlaw, the public still got more than the censors bargained for.
There was cleavage in it. And of course, in those days, you didn't show any cleavage at all. And it was, I remember the shot they got, as a matter of fact, and it was not even supposed to be in there because it was an accident. It was, there was the bed, and Billy the kid was lying on the bed, and the camera was right across from me, and I leaned over.
I remember now. I caught one yesterday, didn't I?
Yesterday. It was a month ago. You've been terribly sick.
Hughes had more substance than the typical Hollywood playboy, but in the late 1940s, that seemed his role as he dated stars like Ava Gardner and Lana Turner.
Those relationships with the women around his age were a brief period of time, 4, 5, 6 years, that he was involved with women his own age and who were famous actresses. The women throughout most of the remainder of that period were very, very young. They were starlets or aspiring starlets, usually in their teens. The older he got, the younger the women got.
Hughes thought nothing of placing women under contract to his production company, even when he lacked a movie for them to act in. His relationship lasted 5 years with young Terry Moore, but most of the liaisons were brief and superficial.
Howard brought a lot of girls from all over and put them under contract, and he had agents who worked for him, and a lot of people full-time, who were going around the
$9 million in 1948 to buy RKO Studios. But he interfered in so many projects, the studio lost most of its key employees. It lost more when Hughes suddenly fired 100 workers on grounds that they were communists. He refused to list screenwriter Paul Jericho in a movie's credits for the same reason. He even appeared in court the last time he would do so to denounce the writer. In Korea, American troops were fighting more tangible forms of communism, and Hughes Aircraft supplied the choppers.
The aircraft producer unveils his monster helicopter to the public and Air Force officers at Culver City, California. Powered by turbojet motors, the huge copter is designed primarily to lift great weights. It is the largest aircraft of its kind known, and when perfected, it is expected to take off and carry the load of a small freight car, and in passenger models, upwards of 100 persons. The copter itself weighs 40,000 pounds, and its rotating blades measure 125 feet from tip to tip.
Biography's profile of Howard Hughes will consider the 1950s was a boomtown of interest to Howard Hughes, but beneath its glitz and glamour, he was becoming more a recluse. His business instincts remained sharp, though, as did his belief that charity begins at home. And in 1953, he established the Howard Hughes Medical Institute.
The Howard Hughes Medical Institute ultimately took control of Hughes Aircraft Company, owned the entire company. It was an unusual charity in the sense that it began its life as the Howard Hughes Medical Institute, which was created in theory to fund medical research.
Hughes now prowled casinos along the Strip in Las Vegas for female company, using underlings to obtain signed releases that the women wouldn't talk to the media. The fear of infectious disease instilled in him by his mother long ago now bore its singular fruit.
Pretty soon he got to the point where he would demand that everything that was handed to him be handed to him with layers of paper towels or Kleenex around it. That his employees, even who were typing notes about meetings that he attended, maybe notes that he'd never see, but they had to wear white gloves. He had people scrubbing and washing everything that he would ever have to touch, and even began himself to scrub and wash with Kleenex everything that he touched to protect himself.
Hughes kept his hand in Hollywood in the 1950s with movies like The French Line and a typical Howard Hughes way to publicize the star attraction. To Hughes, protests from church groups only meant improved receipts at the box office. Another of his movies came with scandal built in when director Roberto Rossellini fell in love with leading lady Ingrid Bergman in an affair considered notorious for the time. The suggestive volcano erupting poster that Hughes came up with was pulled by censors. The Conqueror was an epic starring Susan Hayward and one of Howard Hughes' favorite actors, John Wayne. The sets were often lavish in a Hughes movie, and the action usually more important than artistic merit. Another movie starring John Wayne began production in 1949 and was not released until 1957 because Hughes spent so much time editing and re-editing the flying scenes. By the time it reached the theaters, the jets shown in it were obsolete.
Who was she, this girl who could handle a jet or an embrace with equal ease?
In 1957, Hughes married Jean Peters, an on and off friend of some years. Some saw this as his tactic to prevent others from having him declared mentally incompetent. His biographer, Donald Steele, relates the fiasco his meddling caused at TWA.
Trans World Airlines had to buy a jet fleet in the late 1950s. And to finance that jet fleet, which was going to be several hundred millions of dollars, even Howard Hughes did not have that kind of money. And so it was trying to deal with that dilemma, how to come up with the money versus not surrendering any control, that eventually was to almost destroy TWA and mentally really brought on his second major mental collapse.
A bizarre sequence of events now occurred as Hughes checked into the Beverly Hills Hotel. From his rented bungalow, he called Noah Dietrich, made him come to the hotel for a meeting, and then dispatched him to Houston with orders to increase profits at Hughes Tool Company. Then Hughes telephoned his Mormon aide, Bill Gay, and announced he was firing Dietrich, his associate of 30 years. He left Los Angeles for Montreal, and he became a kind of frequent flyer run amok in a cruel parody of the historic flights he had made years before. After a period in Montreal, he flew to the Bahamas. The need to escape business problems and people conflicts led him on a quixotic search for sanctuary. But in the Bahamas, he suffered another nervous collapse. 6 months later, Hughes resurfaced and flew back to California. He moved into Rancho Santa Fe with wife Jean Peters, ready to start another unpredictable chapter in his life. To obtain his fleet of jets for TWA in 1960, Howard Hughes was forced to borrow $265 million. With the deal, he lost control of the airline he had owned for 15 years. The stress of this period is visible in the last known photograph of Hughes, taken in 1961. On the heels of that loss, Hughes made a lowball estimate to produce helicopters, costing Hughes Aircraft $90 million. In 1966, Hughes boarded a train in Los Angeles, the first time he had ventured out of the house in 4.5 years. He headed east on another of his journeys that was part escape, part search. After staying 4 months at the Ritz-Carlton in Boston, he packed his bags for Las Vegas. By this time, he was estranged from his wife and from everybody else. He began to show worrisome personal traits, such as refusing to bathe or even wear clothes for days at a time. Taking the penthouse floor of the Desert Inn, Hughes embarked on a buying spree of local properties. He broke contact with his Los Angeles office as he found a fresh lease on business life in the desert. He hired a new right-hand man, Bob Mayhew, who, strangely enough, would never meet his boss face to face. In just a year, Hughes spent $65 million acquiring various casinos, 2 small airlines, and the local TV station. Then Jean Peters filed for divorce and received 20 years of alimony payment in return for silence. Bob Mayhew lost his perks when Hughes fired him.
This is so unlike Mr. Hughes. I have known him to be a very compassionate man. We have had such an unusually excellent relationship. I have represented him at high levels I have carried on very responsible assignments for him. My relationship, unfortunately, it appears, was always with, well, or has been rather, for the last 8 years directly with him.
But you never met him?
That is correct. I have seen him.
That's rather unusual for a business relationship.
It is not unusual in the Hughes world.
Now, Hughes decided to quit Las Vegas. A rare checkup showed he was suffering from kidney disease and codeine and Valium abuse. That didn't prevent his departure for the Bahamas. In 1972, the biggest publishing hoax of the century was almost pulled off by Clifford Irving, who professed to be Howard Hughes' official biographer.
Much of his book was obtained from manuscript of my book, a great deal of it.
Irving denied all charges, but Hughes was yet to be heard from.
Everyone believed that these were valid interviews. He knew that they were a fraud, and so did all of his staff, because he had never met Clifford Irving. And no one would believe it until he spoke publicly. So he had to come forth and speak. He talked on the telephone to a number of interviewers, and it again was an example of how he could pull himself together remarkably for brief periods of time.
This is supposedly testimony before a federal grand jury in Miami, in which you were described as being, it would be in December 1970.
Oh, you mean the 97-pound waist-length beard and so forth?
Not 97, Mr. Hughes. Just a second here. It says you were a 6-foot-tall man, weighing only 94 pounds, with a beard to his chest, hair to the middle of his back, and fingernails and toenails from 6 to 8 inches long.
Well, the statistics are that I am 6 feet 3 3/4 inches, which is what I've always been. Just barely under 6 feet 4. And I would guess in the 140 to 50 area. I am thin, I've always been thin. And what was the other statistics?
Yeah, the toenails 6 to 8 inches long.
Well, this is just inconceivable. If I had toenails 8 inches long, I couldn't walk. Fingernails 8 inches long, I couldn't write my name. That was the one thing that was the first means of disproving it that came to my mind.
We have heard that recording many times, and anybody who's heard it thinks you're listening to a man who's absolutely lucid, complete possession of his faculties. And even when he's asked questions about allegedly the long toenails and the long hair and the unkempt appearance, the way he chuckles and sloughs that off, it's with such a confidence and ease, you can't believe, listening to that it isn't true. But it wasn't true, because one of the things we came across were logs, entries by the aides who were taking care of him that showed his activities minute by minute right around that time. And he was the absolute opposite of the assured, self-possessed individual that you heard on that phone conversation.
More of the life and times of Howard Hughes when biography reached. During his last extended odyssey, Hughes was never seen in public. But one day he broke out of his 15-year isolation after relocating to Nicaragua. Improbably enough, it occurred in the capital city of Managua when he agreed to sit down with General Somoza. The dictator never guessed this was now a man who routinely went half naked and lived on chocolate bars and bottled water. But as one newspaper showed, Hughes knew enough to clean up his act for a state occasion.
He said that this was the first time that he had talked to somebody outside of his small circle of men who run his economic empire. And after talking with me, he felt very well.
The therapy from Somoza was short-lived as Hughes next headed for Canada, where he lived in a darkened room of the Bayshore Inn in Vancouver. After 5 months in Canada, Hughes, now desperately ill, returned to Managua. Here he languished into a childlike and premature old age. The medium he had loved and worked in became a comfort as he watched the same favorite movies over and over again. Perhaps it was the flying scenes he found captivating in this Cold War melodrama. A trip to England coincided with a renewed interest in flying, but one day Hughes fell and broke his hip, and the accident triggered his final decline.
He seemed to perform a kind of mental maneuver that said, germs that come from other people are dangerous. Germs that come from me are not dangerous. And he was very extreme about this. I mean, bathing was something that didn't go on even once a year. Shampooing his hair was something that didn't even go on once a year. Brushing his teeth was unheard of. His teeth simply rotted away because he never touched them with a toothbrush. It seemed very aversive to him to even clean himself in any way, and he resisted this as much as he possibly could.
Memos scrawled in longhand by Hughes almost every day reveal what Howard's obsessions were like toward the end of his life. Logs kept by his orderlies show how often he rested during the day and identify his reliance on BBs or blue bombers for the doses of Valium he needed to sleep. The particulars of Hughes' sedentary and sometimes sordid existence at this time are well documented. Harder to grasp is what was going on inside that once agile mind and powerful imagination. The conceiver of innovative airplanes, romantic movies, and flying boats. In 1973, Hughes was transported from London back to the Bahamas as grand jury indictments, corporate lawsuits, and tabloid rumors all but destroyed his reputation. Another move to Acapulco couldn't hide the fact that the achievements of a lifetime were now lost in a puzzling caricature created in part by the hand of Howard Hughes. The master of publicity was now its victim, and he would never again enjoy any of the limelight or luxury he could afford. When he was near death, it was decided to fly Hughes to his hometown in Texas, a place he had avoided ever since the 1930s. He managed to avoid it this time, too.
As we were taxiing into the customs ramp, the doctor in the back said, just take your time, there's no need to hurry any longer. That's how we knew at that time. He died apparently as we were descending into Houston, just as we were coming in, approaching the airport.
With Howard Hughes, even death could not be taken for granted.
Fingerprints were taken and are being sent to the FBI for a confirmation of identity. The preliminary autopsy findings demonstrated that Mr. Hughes died of chronic renal disease.
In addition to the kidney failure, X-rays revealed there were stubs of broken drug needles still in Hughes' body. Howard Hughes was buried on April 7, 1976. About 20 relatives gathered to hear a minister read from the book of John. We brought nothing into the world, and it is certain we will take nothing out. And that was the problem. Who was the rightful heir to the incredible fortune Howard Hughes left behind? One will, later proved bogus, awarded a 16th of the Hughes estate to Melvin Dumar, a gas station attendant later depicted in a film by Jonathan Demme.
I went around and I applied for a job at places like McDonnell Douglas, Northrop, Hughes.
Well, what happened there?
They didn't want me.
What a shame.
How come you keep saying that? What a shame.
Well, I might have done something.
Like what?
I'm Howard Hughes.
One of the fascinating things I think preoccupied people so much about Hughes after he died was the question of his will. Who would get the money? Who did he leave it to? And they couldn't imagine somebody with that kind of wealth and that influence and that far-reaching an empire not having a will. But we were absolutely convinced that he did not have a will, at least a valid will at that time. And I think the courts have so basically ruled in terms of the way the estate was later distributed to the heirs. And the reason for that was very simple. Hughes got to the point in his life where he thought signing a will was in somehow or another ending his own life. I mean, that may seem like a dramatic statement, but he constantly used the will or the notion of being able to distribute some of those riches to others as a way to get people to do things for him. He was always telling those around him, well, you know, you're in my will.
It's possible to speculate on why this man of action and adventure and of so many different guises did what he did, and in such controversial fashion, and how it might have all come out differently.
I thought, here was a man that just needed some tender, loving care. How very sad that this man...
But no one can change a life hell-bent on making itself. Howard Hughes chartered a flight through our time uniquely his own. Right after Hughes' death, the director of his hotels commented, "It is tragic that Howard Hughes had to die to prove that he was alive." One mystery, the mystery of Hughes' will, still has not been totally cleared up. All sorts of fake wills have turned up over the years. In fact, so many that in May of 1976, one Philip Hammersmith took out an ad in a Miami paper. He offered documentation that would make the bearer the sole